Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. Many a time in videos I've mentioned wet palettes. If you subscribe, you'll probably notice my wet palette appearing in the corner of videos as I'm painting. Thought it's finally time to explain to you here hints, tips and techniques for using a wet palette, why you might want to use one, and how to build what I think is the best one for about £1. I'll also explain why I slid my green mat to one side to show you the table later on. Now this is my wet palette. This is very simply a Sistema sandwich box that I bought quite a few years ago for about £1. You can still get these things for £1 as well. Now I'm going to be painting up some Death Guard this week, but it's relevant for whatever models you're doing. Now stage one when setting up for a new project for me is cleaning up and setting up the wet palette, so I'm going to show you how. Now this is a sandwich box. It's sealable, it's airtight, it's got some clips at the side, and that's relatively important to be airtight because otherwise a lot of the water we're going to put in later will evaporate out if it's not sealable, and there's reasons for that we'll explain later. Now first thing I will do is give it a clean. I will spray it with some antibacterial spray, give it a wipe out. It's important because you're going to have standing water in this palette and you can get mould and mank in them. Now I've never had that happen in this particular palette because again I clean it every single week. Certain palettes that you buy, you use the same foam or the same sponge at the bottom of the palette for weeks or months on end, and you can get a bit of a moulding problem if you don't make sure it's clean first. Now some palettes you buy will have a sponge. All I use is kitchen towel. So fold it up into a couple of thicknesses and then fold those layers into the palette you can see here. So you'll end up with maybe sort of 4 layers of kitchen roll out of 1 or 2 pieces, depending on the size and thickness of the kitchen roll, obviously. Now once I've folded it, I put it the way around so there's a nice flat surface for the next stage. Fill it with water and then swirl the water around and drain any excess out. Now this is just a layer that is going to hold the water, and this is what a wet palette is for. A wet palette is basically designed to keep your paints moist so you can use them for longer. It'll cut down on waste. It also kind of pre-waters your paint down. But we're not putting paint straight on top of the kitchen roll because obviously that would absorb everywhere. So what I use is parchment paper. Now this parchment roll I bought from Lakeland, which is like a kitchenware store in the UK. And I've probably been using this one roll for about 5 years. That's at a guess because you don't use a lot of it. And this parchment paper comes in huge lengths in this little box you've seen there. So it's relatively good value. I said the pot I bought for about £1, and this parchment paper, I think at the time was about £4 or £5. Like I say, I've not bought some for years, but it does last you a long time. Now parchment paper is going to be sort of matte on one side, shiny on the other. Now this is the membrane that you're going to put the paint on. What it allows you to do is water will absorb through the membrane from underneath and go into the paint, but in very, very small volumes. The more water you put onto the kitchen roll, the more it will soak through. So when these things start drying out, less paint will suck through the membranes. Now what I always do, and this is what I've found works, is I'll hold it to one side and I will drain out any excess water that's in here because I don't want the palette being super wet. So as explained before, the wetter it is, the more that can absorb through that parchment paper and the more watery your paint will get. Now that is the whole point of the wet palette, we said before, to water down the paint kind of automatically so you don't have to do it yourself. But I find I like a balance. I don't want my paint to get too watery. Now some people do. Some people like to paint almost with glazes all the time. And in that case, you just make sure there's more standing water in your wet palette. So I'm going to do the example with Rakarth Flesh as Citadel base paint because I'm currently painting some pre-Heresy Death Guard. But it works the same for all paints. Now the base paint is quite a thick paint. So we'll show you with some other paints later on about how they react differently. Now a nice blob of paint using the brush onto the wet palette, and then paint as you should be, whether it's on a wet palette or using a plate or using a piece of cardboard. Use the end of your brush to draw some of that paint out of the main blob you've put down, thin it out across the palette and then start painting with it. Beauty of the wet palette is as you thin it across away from the main blob, it will water down slightly and go on your model smoother and easier, more controllable. So let's see what happens once you've left it on the palette for 24 hours. You can see a little bit of condensation on the inside of that lid because again it's a sealed lid. The reason you want it sealed and airtight is if it's not, you'll get tons of evaporation out of the wet palette, especially if you're in a hot climate, and it's almost like a normal palette and your paint will have dried out. But we can see here the paint is still wet. You can see that slightly blacky shiny area, that's the water that's then separating the paint. So I'm just mixing it in and that paint is thoroughly perfectly usable again. Slightly more watery than it was the previous day, but it's not gone to the point that it's not usable. If it ever does go to the point it's not usable because you've left it for days and days and days and it thins out too much, you can just take a bit of tissue, drop it into that sort of darker, blacker area, and you will wick out just the water from it, and it will then thicken the paint up slightly. But you can see here how thin it had gone. It's perfectly paintable, perfectly usable, and it would be probably the same level of water in there as if you put it onto a plate and put water in manually. So another 24 hours later, the previous night's painting session, I used all of the paint that was on that palette, or all the blob of paint anyway, and we've just got the paint residue that was left spread across the parchment paper. And as you can see here, I've rubbed the end of the brush over, and actually that paint is still perfectly usable and perfectly paintable with. So you can see how using a wet palette will save you a fortune in paint over the years, because all these little micro blobs that you'd be putting out of your pot, you know, all be drying, you'd be wasting half of it, and it certainly adds up over the years. Now I'm going to show you different types of paint and how they go on a wet palette. Now metallics, I'll put a blob of the metallic paint down. This is a Retributor Armour. A lot of people say you can't use metallic paints on a wet palette. Now you can. But the difficulty comes once you've left it for a longer period of time. When you first put it on, it doesn't absorb much paint through, but what it does do is, if you're doing some dry brushing or you're doing whatever and you're using a lot of metallics quickly, is it stops it drying out super quick. So when you leave it overnight, you maybe potentially have an issue. You've seen there I've used the shade paint. I'm now going to use a Vallejo model wash. I'm going to put a contrast paint on there as well. Leave it for 24 hours and then show you what it looks like and discuss why you may or may not want to put these paints on here. Now, another really good thing about a wet palette is when you're mixing your own paints. Now, for certain hobby projects, you're going to want to do like a highlight stage or a layering stage or wet blending or whatever, and you will end up mixing your own paint. You can see the example here, a dark blue and a light blue. Ordinarily, you'd do whatever mix it is you're after, and then you'd have the trouble of working out how to do that same mix again. And if you're doing a few figures with that mix, you might encounter the problem of it not being the same. The wet palette helps you counter that, because those paints will still be usable the following day, for 2 days, for 3 days after. Now, let's look at all these different paints. We've already talked about, the Rakarth Flesh, the base colour. So again, just mix that back in and that's now perfectly usable again. Looking at the other paints on the palette, you can see, hopefully on this video, you can see how they've watered themselves down. So the blues, it would be a simple case of just mixing them together, because you can see that excess water that's sat in there. Again, as I said before, if there was too much, you could take a bit of tissue, drop it into the end and let it absorb. Now, the metallics, let's talk about mixing metallic ink, because now, if you just mix that water in, it's hard to tell on camera, but that metallic paint has now almost changed in colour. There's almost like a silvery sheen now, because the flakes of metal that build up metallic paint have separated. You can see, putting it on the tissue paper there, it's almost gone silvery rather than the bronze. Now actually quite usable as almost a highlight colour, but putting it on the armour there, you can see it is slightly different, and that's the problem with letting metallic paints water down on a wet palette. So just bear that in mind. Sometimes they might not be ideal, but again, you could just wipe off this metallic paint and actually you wouldn't have wasted any more than you would have done if you'd have had it on a normal palette. Now, going through the shades, all it's done to the shade paint is watered it down a bit more. The contrast paint, there was a bit of a problem, because the contrast paint now won't act like contrast is meant to, because it's now probably 50% more watery. So just bear that one in mind. Whilst you're using the contrast paint straight away, it's probably fine. But if you've noticed in my painting videos, I will use contrast paints and things straight from the pot. Now, here is the problem, however, with putting washes and contrasts onto your wet palette. It almost works in reverse. The paint leaches through the parchment and goes into that tissue layer, which could wreck the palette sponge if you're using a palette that you'd bought and that sponge was meant to be used again and again. So it's not necessarily usable for all paints, but the wet palette is a definite must for me personally. I said before, I've mentioned why I pulled my green mat to the side and showed the table. I started using this Systema sandwich pot when I had very limited space after the kids were born. I've been using this kind of size for years and years and years now, even when I've got a hobby room and I've got all the space in the world that I could take over. This for me is the perfect wet palette to be using. So hopefully you enjoyed that. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, and hopefully I'll see you on another video.